What up, my peeps? So, I've been thinking to myself, what am I going to do with this giant bag of corn that I have? And then I found out it's actually legal to distill in Germany, as long as the still is smaller than 1/2 a liter. And I have that. So bingo! Today we're going to make some moonshine. Before I get into it, I just want to make a few disclaimers. Number one, I'm not an expert in distilling, and it's definitely a fine art. There's a bunch of places where you have to make judgment calls, and it can get pretty complicated. But my goal here is just to show the basics behind it. Number two, it might be wise to check to see what the legality is in your situation. It's not always legal everywhere, including in the US, so just keep that in mind. Okay, before we get into this, I quickly wanted to clarify what exactly distilling is. In terms of alcohol, distilling is the process of taking something that's already alcoholic like beer or wine and increasing the concentration by reducing the water and other stuff in it. For example, if you distill wine, you get brandy, which is much stronger. Or in the case of whiskey, you start by making something known as a wash, which is very similar to beer but without hops, and then you distill it. This increases the strength of it, and then you age it. Now moonshine, or corn whiskey as it's also known, is the simple cousin to whiskey. So moonshine lacks that crucial aging step, which gives whiskey that more refined, polished taste. Now keep in mind that distilling will only increase the concentration of alcohol, so we need to actually start by making something alcoholic. So today's video will focus on that beer-like alcoholic liquid known as the wash. It's the base of what we're going to actually distill in next week's video. Alright, so let's make some wash. So for corn whiskey, we're going to try to do it as a simple all corn recipe. So not including water, we only really need 3 ingredients for this: corn, amylase, and yeast. I'll explain what amylase is in a minute, but for right now, let's focus on the corn. For this recipe, we need about 2 pounds or roughly 1 kilogram of corn for every 1 gallon or about 4 liters of water. I'm going to be making 8 liters of wash, so I need about 2 kilograms of corn. I'm going to start by terribly pouring corn all over my kitchen counter because I didn't learn my lesson from last time I worked with this awkward bag. So once I cleaned up the corn mess, I measured out what I needed, and we just need to rinse this off, trying to get any dirt or anything that's on the corn out of it. So the next step was we actually need to crush the corn to get at the insides of them. There's a couple ways of doing this. If you have a grain crusher, you can use that. If not, you can also do it by hand by using a mortar and pestle. I used also a coffee grinder, or you can also use a food processor. Once everything is ground up, we need to heat the water up. Now when it comes to what temperature we need to heat the water to, there's a bit of a fork in the road. So I'm going to heat my water in this jam/glue vine container to about 65 degrees Celsius or 150 degrees Fahrenheit. So while the water is heating up, let's explain this fork in the road. But first, let's talk a little bit about seeds. When a seed is planted in the ground, it needs to have enough energy to be able to sprout from the ground and develop enough so that it can harvest the energy from the sun. Give this seed a kickstart. Plants pack seeds with a bunch of energy to get it through the first few days. This energy takes the form of a plant's version of fat, which is known as starch. Now starch is essentially a carbohydrate that is a chain of sugars linked together. This is mostly what the powdery inside of the corn actually is. The problem is that yeast cannot turn starch into alcohol, but it can turn sugar into alcohol. So we need a way to break the chain of sugars in the starch back into its individual components. Enter amylase. So amylase is an enzyme that does exactly this inside of the seed. It takes starch and turns it into sugar for the seed to use as energy. Now you can get amylase by malting your own grains, and there's plenty of cool ways to do that. But today we're going to take a shortcut, and I'm going to use an enzyme that's pre-packaged and ready to go. Now this enzyme works at around 65 degrees Celsius or 150 degrees Fahrenheit, much hotter, and the enzyme will actually denature. So enough with the impromptu biology lesson. Why are we heating the water? Well, one thing we need to do is we actually need to heat the water to near boiling to release the starch from the corn. Problem is that starch molecules tend to stick to each other and will thicken up whatever's being boiled. This is what's known as gelatinization. Now, to avoid dealing with a thick, gloopy mess of corn, we can make a pre-mash by heating the water to 65 degrees and turning some of the starch into sugar, then heat it up to 100 degrees to release all the rest of the starch, then let it cool, and then turn the remaining starch into sugar. So back to our recipe. Once the pot got up to 65 degrees Celsius, I added the corn and gave it a stir. We can then add about 1 teaspoon of our powdered amylase to the corn, and we're going to let this sit here for about 40 minutes. And at this temperature, the enzyme will be able to do its job. The next step is to heat up the mash to boiling. This will denature the amylase, but it will allow us to start getting the rest of the starch out of the corn. As it's heating, make sure to stir it every few minutes, ensuring no grains are sticking to the bottom and scorching. Once the mash gets to boiling, allow it to boil there for about 15 minutes, keeping a closer eye and stirring more frequently. During the 15 minutes, the starches should be released and it should start to thicken up a little bit. After 15 minutes, turn off the heat and allow the corn mash to cool back down to 65 degrees. Once it does, add another teaspoon of amylase and let it sit for another 40 minutes. Now we're really reaching the finish line here. While the starches are being converted into sugar, I sterilized my fermenter, and after the 40 minutes were up, let it cool down. I cooled mine down by putting it into the fermenter, sealing it up, and placing it in a bathtub with cool water for about 20 minutes. Once the mash cools down to about 25 degrees Celsius, I took a refractometer reading and pitched my yeast. I'm using wine yeast here, which has a higher alcohol tolerance than beer yeast. I saw that I got about 15 bricks, or about 1.062 specific gravity, so if all goes well, this should give me an alcoholic wash at around 8%, which is pretty good. I set the fermenter into a cool place, and I'm going to let it sit here for a week. So this concludes part 1 of making moonshine. Next week, I'm going to show you how to turn the alcoholic mash into a higher strength corn whiskey. Now, if you don't want to miss next week's episode, please be sure to subscribe, and thanks for watching. Bye!